The seventh tanker, a Hellfire missile through the engine room. Another vessel disabled in the approaches to Iranian waters. Another ship that departed from a port somewhere in the world carrying cargo bound for Iranian buyers and arrived at a different destination than the one on its manifest. Specifically, the condition of being dead in the water with a hole in its propulsion system that American forces put there with deliberate, documented, officially confirmed precision. 7 disabled tankers, not as isolated incidents spread across the conflict's operational noise, as a pattern. A deliberate, escalating, systematically executed pattern that each new disabled vessel makes more visible and more consequential and more economically devastating to the institution that sent those ships to their fates. And the phrase that accompanies the seventh tanker is the phrase that changes the analytical frame for everything that follows it. The blockade is now the most aggressive it has ever been, not more active. Not more visible, the most aggressive. And those two words, most aggressive, carry a specific operational meaning that the conflict has been building toward for 3 months, and that the seventh disabled tanker is the clearest possible proof that the building is complete and the structure it built is now fully operational, because the blockade is not simply a naval enforcement action that turns ships around and fires warning shots and occasionally disables a vessel that refuses to comply. In its most aggressive phase, it is a systematic, deliberate, comprehensively executed financial strangling of the specific revenue mechanism that funds the organization running the war, at the exact moment when that organization has no remaining financial redundancy to absorb the strangling with 7 tankers, most aggressive. Those are not progress report data points. They are the operational expression of a strategy reaching the phase it was always designed to reach. To understand why the 7th disabled tanker represents something categorically different from the 6th or the 5th or the 1st, you need to understand what the pattern of disabled tankers has been doing to the shipping industries. Collective risk calculation with every iteration. The first disabled tanker told every ship operator in the global maritime industry that the United States Navy was prepared to use kinetic force against vessels attempting to run the blockade. That was new information. It was absorbed, assessed, and processed into the risk calculations that every company operating in or near the Gulf was running. War risk insurance premiums moved from approximately 0.12% of vessel value to approximately 5%, a 40-fold increase that reflected the market's collective assessment of what that new information meant for the operational environment. The second disabled tanker confirmed that the first was not an aberration. The third confirmed it was a pattern. The 4th, 5th, and 6th confirmed that the pattern was not subject to diplomatic protest, international legal challenge, or shipping company lobbying pressure that would cause the enforcement to soften. And the 7th disabled tanker confirms something that the previous 6 could not confirm individually, but that the accumulation of all 7 confirms definitively. The enforcement is not reaching its limit. It is intensifying. The most aggressive phase declaration alongside the 7th disabled vessel means that every ship operator who calculated that waiting out the enforcement speak before attempting a run at Iranian waters was a viable strategy has now received the specific information that the peak is not behind them. It is still ahead of them. The network effect of 7 disabled tankers on the collective decision-making of the global shipping industry is not the linear sum of 7 individual risk reassessments. It is the compound effect of an industry that has concluded the enforcement will continue to escalate, and that therefore the calculation for any vessel attempting to reach Iranian ports is not better than it was when the 6th tanker was disabled. It is worse. The legal architecture of the blockade is the dimension of the 7th disabled tanker story that most coverage mentions briefly and moves past, and that deserves substantially more analytical attention than the headline number of disabled vessels. A naval blockade is a recognized instrument of international law with specific requirements for its establishment and enforcement. The formal declaration must be announced, the parties affected must be notified, and the enforcement must be applied consistently without discriminating between the flags of vessels from different neutral nations. The United States has been scrupulous about the legal framework of the blockade's establishment and operation, and that scrupulousness is not accidental or simply legalistic, it is strategic. A blockade that operates within the recognized framework of international maritime law is a blockade that the international community cannot easily characterize as piracy, that neutral states cannot claim as interfering with their legitimate commercial rights, and that the United Nations Security Council cannot condemn without implicitly condemning the mechanism by which international law has allowed naval powers to enforce their interests in contested maritime spaces for centuries. The formal declaration that all vessels are advised to return to port if leaving and to discontinue transit to Iran if that is the next port of call, issued through the appropriate maritime communication channels, notified to the appropriate maritime authorities, and enforced consistently against vessels of multiple flags without singling out any specific nation's shipping, is the legal architecture that makes the most aggressive phase politically sustainable in ways that an ad hoc enforcement operation would not be. Every disabled tanker has been disabled after the captain received the required warnings and refused to comply. The hellfire through the engine room is not the first communication the captain received, it is the last one. And the legal architecture that requires it to be the last rather than the first is the architecture that keeps the international community from having a coherent legal objection to the enforcement while simultaneously ensuring that the enforcement's escalation to its most aggressive phase is defensible at every international forum where it might be challenged. The financial mathematics of 7 disabled tankers plus 28 or more vessels redirected plus the $500 million a day in blocked oil revenue plus the 80% reduction in Iranian crude exports from 1.7 million barrels per day in March to approximately 300,000 barrels per day in the most recent reporting period produces a cumulative damage number that the abstraction of daily figures consistently fails to make visceral enough to carry its full weight. 7 weeks of blockade at $500 million per day is approximately $24.5 billion in accumulated financial damage. Against an annual oil revenue that was approximately $45 billion before the conflict began, the blockade has already removed more than half a year's worth of Iran's primary revenue in 7 weeks of enforcement. The $45 billion per year that oil revenue represented was not evenly distributed across the Iranian economy as a general government funding source. Oil revenue in Iran's specific political economy functions primarily as the financial oxygen of the IRG's operational architecture. The proxy networks, the missile production, the drone manufacturing, the domestic security enforcement apparatus, the salaries of the Revolutionary Guard members and Basij personnel who constitute the regime's coercive capacity, all of it flows from the oil revenue that the blockade is blocking. $24.5 billion of accumulated damage in 7 weeks is $24.5 billion removed from the accounts that fund every dimension of the institution that is running the war. And the 7th disabled tanker is the enforcement event that marks the blockade's entry into its most aggressive phase. Which means the daily $500 million rate is not the ceiling, it is the floor. The most aggressive phase means the enforcement is tightening, not holding steady. The number that comes after $24.5 billion will be larger because the phase that follows 7 disabled tankers is the phase that is less tolerant of the shadow mechanisms and the alternative routing that the previous phase allowed to partially compensate for the primary oil export revenues elimination, the Karg Island dimension is the thread that connects the 7th disabled tanker to the most consequential potential escalation that the most aggressive phase could represent. Karg Island is where 90% of Iran's oil is exported. The terminal infrastructure on the island, the loading facilities, the storage tanks, the pipeline connections from the onshore oil fields, the navigational channels that tankers use to approach and depart the loading terminals, constitutes the single most important piece of economic infrastructure in Iran's entire physical geography. Before the conflict began, the oil that departed Karg Island in a continuous stream of tanker traffic represented the primary financial life support of the Islamic Republic. More than 90% of the oil that left Karg was bound for China, the discounted price relationship that gave Iran access to the hard currency the sanctions regime was trying to deny it. Every tanker that loaded at Karg and completed its voyage to Chinese ports converted Iranian crude into the dollars that funded the IRG's operational accounts, the proxy network financing, the missile and drone production, and every other dimension of the Islamic Republic's ability to project power beyond its borders. The 7 disabled tankers are the blockade's enforcement against individual vessels attempting to access that revenue stream after it was formally cut. The most aggressive phase is the blockade tightening the enforcement perimeter around the specific geography that the revenue stream flows through, tightening it in ways that the previous enforcement phase allowed to be partially circumvented through shadow fleet operations, flag of convenience tankers, AIS system deactivation, and the various methods that sanctioned states develop to maintain commercial activity in the face of enforcement that targets the visible rather than the concealed. Karg Island's continued ability to load tankers with any portion of Iran's oil production is the last remaining operational element of the financial architecture that the blockade was designed to eliminate. The most aggressive phase is the phase in which that remaining element comes under enforcement pressure that the previous 6 disabled tankers were preparation for rather than the primary action of. Iran's response options to a 7th disabled tanker and a most aggressive blockade phase are the options of a military that has lost its primary conventional capacities and is running its remaining asymmetric capabilities from a degraded infrastructure at a degraded resource level. The fast attack boats at Bandar Abbas are still there, distributed through warehouse facilities, capable of moving at 4250 knots through coastal waters. The mine-laying capability persists as a low-visibility operation that does not require the radar infrastructure that the Keshem Islands strikes removed. The drone inventory that survived previous strikes and the blockade-constrained production rate is still available for harassment operations, but the operational effectiveness of each of those capabilities against the 7th disabled tankers enforcement context is lower than it was against the first. Because the most aggressive phase is not the same enforcement posture as the initial blockade declaration. It includes the two carrier strike groups providing surveillance and strike coverage. The P-8 Poseidon and MQ for Seat Righton surveillance platforms that have been watching every Iranian coastal facility and documenting every fast attack boat movement for months. The mine clearance operation that is actively removing the mine barrier that was supposed to funnel commercial shipping into the fast attack boat's engagement range, and the Keshem Island obliteration that removed the command coherence from the IRG's maritime operations. The most aggressive phase of the blockade is the phase that Iran's remaining response options are the least capable of contesting, because the capabilities that would have made contesting it costly for the American enforcement force have been systematically removed through exactly the sequence of operations that preceded the 7th disabled tanker. The global shipping industry's adaptation to 7 disabled tankers and the most aggressive blockade phase is the economic story underneath the military story, and it is a story that has implications extending well beyond the immediate conflict. The war risk insurance market has repriced the Gulf operational environment in ways that are not fully reversible through diplomatic announcements or ceasefire declarations. Underwriters at Lloyd's of London and the P&I clubs that provide liability coverage for the global merchant fleet are not going to restore pre-conflict pricing to a corridor where 7 vessels have been disabled by Hellfire missiles until the operational conditions that justified the repricing have been changed by something more durable than a ceasefire. The ships that have been going dark, switching off their automatic identification system transponders to avoid detection as they attempt corridor transits, are operating in a commercial and legal gray zone that the insurance repricing has pushed them into. A vessel operating without AIS has voided the coverage conditions of most standard marine insurance policies, which means the shadow fleet operations that Iran has been using to partially compensate for the primary tanker blockade are operations being conducted by vessels that are uninsured for the specific risks they are running. The accumulation of 7 disabled tankers and the most aggressive phase declaration is accelerating the shipping industry's structural movement away from any Iranian-associated routing, because the commercial cost of the enforcement, both the direct cost of potential disablement and the indirect cost of the insurance repricing, has now exceeded the commercial benefit of whatever premium the Iranian side was offering for the service of attempting to breach the blockade. The shipping industry adaptation to the most aggressive blockade phase is the commercial dimension of the enforcement's success that operates through market mechanisms rather than through Hellfire missiles. China's position in the most aggressive blockade phase is the strategic dimension that makes the 7th disabled tanker more than an Iran story. Before the conflict began, China was receiving more than 90% of the oil that left Karg Island through a shadow fleet operation that allowed Chinese state-connected shipping companies to purchase Iranian crude at significantly below market prices and transport it to Chinese ports through a combination of ship-to-ship transfers, flag changes, and the specific operational methods that evade sanctions tracking. That arrangement provided Iran with the hard currency the sanctions regime was designed to deny it and provided China with discounted oil that its economy consumed happily. The most aggressive blockade phase is explicitly targeting the shadow fleet operations that made that arrangement possible. A 7th disabled tanker operating as part of the Chinese-Iranian shadow trade network is a specific enforcement action against a specific Chinese economic interest, delivered in the form of a Hellfire missile through an engine room. Xi Jinping's public statement that the Strait of Hormuz should remain open for normal passage was not simply a diplomatic observation about international maritime law. It was a supply chain statement from a country that has been watching the enforcement of the blockade get systematically more aggressive in ways that are specifically targeting the commercial mechanism through which China was accessing discounted Iranian oil. The most aggressive phase is not just the most aggressive phase against Iran. It is the most aggressive phase against the economic arrangement that was allowing Iran to partially circumvent the financial strangulation that the blockade was designed to execute. China will not go to war over disabled tankers. But the most aggressive phase is changing China's calculation about whether the discounted Iranian oil is worth the operational risk of the shipping companies that were running the shadow fleet continuing to do so in an enforcement environment that has now demonstrated 7 times that it will disable vessels attempting to run the blockade. The IRG's last financial lifelines are what the most aggressive phase is specifically designed to find and remove, and identifying them requires understanding what has survived the previous phases of enforcement long enough to still be operational. The primary oil export revenue through the official tanker trade is gone, blocked by the initial blockade declaration and enforced by 7 disabled vessels. The shadow fleet operation that was providing partial compensation for the official trade's closure is being progressively shut down by the combined pressure of the most aggressive enforcement phase and the way's cooperation with the U.S. Treasury in mapping and disrupting the financial network that the shadow fleet payments flowed through. The Pakistan land corridor that was supposed to provide an alternative logistics route for Iranian imports is carrying a fraction of what maritime trade delivered, at 10 to 12 times the cost, through territory controlled by an active insurgency, with bottlenecks at every stage of the customs and transit process, the proxy network. Financing that was supposed to be one of the IRG's revenue-generating mechanisms through the economic activities of its Lebanon and Iraq operations has been compressed by the same financial pressure that is compressing the central organization. What remains is the specific combination of domestic Iranian economic activity that generates rial-denominated revenue without requiring hard currency conversion, and whatever residual shadow banking mechanisms have survived the US Treasury cooperation that has been systematically dismantling the correspondent banking relationships that made rial $2 conversion possible for sanctioned Iranian entities. The most aggressive blockade phase is the phase that goes after those residual mechanisms, not just the tankers in the water, the financial architecture that the tankers were funding. The 14-point framework's relationship with the most aggressive blockade phase is not the simple intensify pressure to accelerate deal relationship that the linear logic of coercive diplomacy would suggest. The most aggressive phase is simultaneously the strongest possible argument for Iran's moderate civilian faction to close the deal, because every day without a deal is another day of most aggressive phase enforcement that is removing the financial mechanisms the regime depends on faster than the previous phases were removing them, and the weakest possible moment for the moderate faction's domestic political position, because the IRG hardline faction is interpreting the most aggressive phase as confirmation that no deal the United States is willing to offer is preferable to the maximum resistance posture. The hardline faction's argument to the Iranian domestic political audience is that the most aggressive blockade is what America does to a country that negotiates, that the reward for entering the diplomatic track has been escalated enforcement rather than relaxed enforcement, and that the only posture that preserves any form of Iranian institutional dignity is continued resistance regardless of the financial cost. The moderate faction's argument is that the financial cost of continued resistance under the most aggressive phase is accelerating the institutional collapse that the resistance is supposed to prevent, and that the deal's terms, however constrained, are survivable in ways that the most aggressive phase's financial damage accumulation is not. Both arguments are being made inside the same political system with the same audience. The most aggressive blockade phase is the pressure that is supposed to determine which argument wins, and the seventh disabled tanker is the data point that tells both factions that the phase producing the argument is not going to soften on its own timeline. Here is what the seventh disabled tanker and the most aggressive blockade phase reveal about the specific moment in the conflict's financial and political timeline that June 2026 represents. 7 tankers, $24.5 billion in accumulated financial damage at $500 million a day over 7 weeks. 80% reduction in crude exports from 1.7 million barrels to 300,000. The shadow fleet under direct enforcement pressure in the most aggressive phase, the Pakistan land corridor failing at 10 times the cost of maritime shipping through territory and active insurgency controls. The US Treasury cooperation dismantling the correspondent banking relationships that shadow fleet payments depended on. The IRG's payroll failing, the rial at 1.32 million to the dollar, food inflation at 112%, the internet blackout continuing for more than 2 months, the 14-point framework consigned, the ceasefire violated with missiles and airport bombings, and the blockade entering its most aggressive phase with the 7th disabled tanker as its operational announcement. The question that the accumulation of all of that produces is not whether the financial pressure is working. It is working. The question is what number comes after 7. What the 8th disabled tanker represents and the 9th and the point at which the accumulated financial damage crosses the specific threshold inside the IRG's organizational calculation where the deal's constraints are less damaging to institutional survival than another day of most aggressive phase enforcement, every disabled tanker has been asking that question. The most aggressive phase declaration is the announcement that the questioning is going to continue at a higher frequency and a higher intensity until the answer arrives. The IRG knows what number produced the Shah's departure in 45 days in 1979. It is running its own version of that arithmetic right now, against an enforcement regime that is more targeted, more comprehensive, and more aggressive than anything that preceded the 7th tanker, and the answer to the question of what number is enough, what financial damage threshold converts the hardline faction's resistance calculation into the moderate faction's acceptance calculation, is the only number in this entire conflict that actually matters. The blockade's most aggressive phase is the most direct attempt this conflict has produced to find it.